All right, so let's talk about our cranial nerves. And the cranial nerves, there's an interesting mnemonic here to help you remember them. On, they traveled and found Voldemort guarding very ancient Horcruxes, okay, or Horcruxes. That may not stick, but if you have another alternate version, I've heard a lot of different versions that help you remember these. That can help you just think about them in a sequential order, but we'll talk about them individually and we'll talk about where they are in the brain as well as their function. Together, these are going to be part of the peripheral nervous system. They're going to also be indicated by the Roman numerals. So you should be comfortable knowing the numerical number as well as the Roman numeral and the actual term, the functional term. Okay, that can be tested on your quizzes. So you should know, for example, CN1 is cranial nerve number 1, and it is the olfactory nerve. Okay, we'll again talk about each of them in the location and function. Now, CN1 is going to be the most superior or anterior. That's going to be the olfactory nerve, and it's going to be responsible for our sense of olfaction. The most inferior or posterior is going to be the hypoglossal. This is going to be coming directly off of the medulla. And this is hypoglossal or cranial nerve number 12. That's going to control things like our tongue muscle movement. All right. And then CN1 and 2 are going to be directly connected to the cerebrum, right? That upper central part of the brain. CN11 is directly attached to the spinal cord. And then all the others will be directly attached to some part of the brainstem, either the midbrain, which we'll talk about, the pons, or the medulla. But these are the exceptions. 1 and 2 part of the cerebrum, 11 part of the spinal cord, right? And everything else is a part of any part of the brainstem. Okay, now again, you need to know the number, as I mentioned, as well as the name, right? The numerical and the name. Now let's talk about CN1, the olfactory nerve. This is the most anterior, as I mentioned. It's connected to the olfactory bulbs, which are going to send off these projections, these fibers that dangle down into the nasal cavity and allow us to pick up sense of smell, right? Our olfaction. So it's a purely sensory cranial nerve in that it has no motor function. It doesn't act to move anything, right? It's only sensory. The optic nerve is going to be connected to the eyeball. It's essentially our sensory nerve to the eye. It's what allows us to perceive the world around us. Okay. It is essentially going to look like the Under Armour symbol. If you look at it really closely, right, it's going to have the optic nerve meeting at the optic chiasm, which is where these paths cross, these sensory fibers cross, and then projecting as the optic tract, right? So optic nerve, optic chiasm, optic tract to create that sort of symbol. Again, this is another purely sensory cranial nerve. Its only function is for our visual and sensory perception. Ocular motor cranial nerve number 3. This is going to be directly anterior to the pons. So now we start getting a little bit more posterior, and this is where we're going to really start wanting to be able to differentiate these functionally in terms of helping us understand where they are located, okay? So the nerves now are all along the midline, right? So we had CN1, CN2, and then 3 is going to be along the midline. It's going to come back in towards the median. This is going to be motor only, so no sensory perception from the ocular motor nerve. It's going to control muscles that move the eyes. These are called our extrinsic ocular muscles, as well as control the size of our pupil by way of controlling some of the muscles of the iris, right? So the ocular motor nerve controlling pupil size and movement of the eyeball to control our gaze. Next, we have the trochlear nerve, and the trochlear nerve is going to be off to the side. It's much smaller usually on models, so this is going to help you distinguish it from the 3, which is ocular motor, but also its location. It's going to move off to the sides of the pons as opposed to being between the midbrain and the pons. So the trochlear nerve, cranial nerve 4, is going to be very tiny, and its function is also to move some of the muscles of the eyes, and again, connected to the lateral aspects of the pons. Now, the note here that you will not likely see this on the donor brains. This is very, very true. Most of the brains that I've seen, by the time we get the brain out of the skull, this nerve is so tiny and so delicate, it's usually ripped off. And so we usually aren't able to preserve it and find it. It's very difficult and very delicate dissection to be able to preserve the trochlear nerve. Now, the trigeminal nerve is much larger, much thicker. We usually are, it's much easier to preserve these. And it's also found off to the sides, but sort of lower, kind of a sequential progression along the sides of the pons. So here's 3 oculomotor, here's 4 very small trochlear, and then here's the thicker trigeminal. And trigeminal will almost look like it's actually 2 nerves stuck together, and it is. Trigeminal is actually 3 different parts. It has 3 divisions that kind of also are functionally divided that create this one structure, the trigeminal nerve. And it's going to be lateral and posterior to the pons and lower than 3 and 4. The abducent nerve, cranial nerve number 6 here. Now, another way to connect this is cranial nerve 6 is going to also be coming back towards the midline. And one of the easy ways to remember this is 3, 6, and eventually we'll talk about 12 down here. So 3, 6, and 12. Those are all more central and more, in the midline rather than some of the others that are off to the sides. Now, 6 is also going to lie between the junction of the pons and the medulla. This is called the pontomedullary junction, right? So that's another way to sort of remember it, whereas 3 is between the midbrain and pons junction. Let's look at facial, which is cranial nerve number 7. Facial is going to be just off to the side. So again, these are going to be, you can sort of count these off, and we'll talk about the progression of how they count in that sequential order. But 6 being the most midline, 7 is going to be the first right off to the side, which is the facial nerve. This is going to control muscles to the face, as well as some of the glands, our salivary glands, submandibular gland, etc., of the oral cavity. So the facial nerve being the lateral to the 6 or abducent. 8 will be just lateral to that. So the vestibulocochlear nerve is going to be right adjacent. And vestibulocochlear is going to be larger in compared to the facial nerve, and it's going to control our sense of hearing and balance, okay? And so that's going to be really important to go towards the inner ear structures like the cochlea and the saccule and the utricle, right? Some of those inner ear regions that help control our balance. Let's look at the glossopharyngeal nerve. The glossopharyngeal nerve, again, just counting in that order, it's the next, but this is really as we descend between the junction of the pons and the medulla. So this is going to be lower off to the sides of the medulla at this point, as opposed to the lower aspect of the pons. Again, this is another one that is usually easily injured. It's very small in comparison to the others, and sometimes really difficult to preserve it. Glossopharyngeal controls sensory innervation to the pharynx. So if you look at the image here, the back of the throat, the pharynx, things like our gag reflex, and just determining that something is in the throat, that sensory perception is through glossopharyngeal. The vagus nerve. So vagus nerve is one definitely for remembering. Definitely star this one. It comes off, again, to the sides of the medulla here. It's going to be much larger, thicker fibers. And vagus nerve is going to be the longest cranial nerve. It starts here in the medulla and goes all the way down to supply the gut. So it supplies many of the other visceral organs along the way. It supplies the throat, gives off some innervation to the pharynx, gives off some innervation to the laryngeal muscles, to the heart, to the lungs, and then the stomach, all the way through to the 2/3 of the colon, okay? So that's the vagus nerve. The accessory nerve, cranial nerve 11, this is going to help control muscles, the sternocleidomastoid muscle, and the trapezius muscle. And then it's also going to give innervation to the muscles that help to control some of the actions of the tongue, right? So I'm sorry, not that's hypoglossal, right? The accessory only does the skeletal muscles, okay? It's not a spinal nerve, so this again is another sort of misnomer here where it is termed the spinal accessory nerve, but it is not coming off of the spinal cord. It is a cranial nerve. Now, hypoglossal cranial nerve 12, this is what controls muscles that move the tongue. This is found between the junction of the medullary pyramids. So we have these sort of bump-like projections on the top of the medulla called the pyramids. And coming off between the pyramids is the fibers that create the hypoglossal nerve. These are also ones that you will usually um, see as just little fibers as opposed to a thick, solid nerve. And then some of these can easily become, damaged or injured. And so these are usually difficult to preserve as well. But they usually have the fibers dangling as opposed to a solid nerve, but they do actually form a nerve. Now, again, helpful way to remember this is that this is also coming back towards the midline. So 3, 6, and 12, if you remember in that order, are going to be right along the center as opposed to the others off to the sides. All right, let's look at some of the midbrain structures here. So the mid-sagittal, if you took a slice right through the middle of the brain, what are some of the structures that you would see? We have the corpus callosum, which divides both of the hemispheres. This also helps the hemispheres to sort of connect or speak to each other. We have the fornix, which is going to be a part of the inferior border of the lateral ventricle. We'll talk about the ventricular system coming up. The ventricular system is actually where we have the cerebrospinal fluid circulating. It's like a cavity within the brain. So that border, the lower border of the lateral ventricle, is formed by the fornix. The thalamus is going to be right lower to the fornix. So this is the thalamus, and the thalamus is connected by the central stalk, the central region called the interthalamic adhesion, but both thalami are connected across the midline, and then that is surrounding the third ventricle. So we'll talk about this space as the third ventricle, but the walls of that space being the thalamus. And the thalamus controls things like our movement as well. Now, the hypothalamus is going to be right below the thalamus. The hypothalamus is anterior and inferior to the thalamus itself. The hypothalamus is really important in secreting things like hormones, our endocrine control, our endocrine glands. And then the hypothalamus is going to signal another part of the brain called the pituitary. This is a gland. So the hypothalamus is a part of the brain, whereas the pituitary is a gland that is connected to the hypothalamus. And it's connected by the infundibulum, which is kind of the stalk, right? If you think about this like a grape hanging from a branch, the stalk or the branch is the infundibulum. The pituitary would be like the fruit, and the hypothalamus would be what it's anchored to, which is a part of the brain. And this is what creates the axis of our endocrine hormones, which we'll talk about in your lecture course. Now, other structures that we can see along the midline here would be parts of the brainstem. So the midbrain, which is the mesencephalon, being the region right below where we have the pituitary. So here's hypothalamus, here's thalamus, here's pituitary, here's the midbrain. Then we have the pons, which we talked about, cross-section of the pons, or sorry, sagittal section of the pons, and then the medulla, sagittal section as well, and then spinal cord. We can also see the cerebellum posteriorly here, and then the cerebrum on the top. Let's look at the ventricular system. So this is, again, the cavity space within the brain. This is where cerebrospinal fluid is circulating before it actually enters the subarachnoid space, which is where it moves around in that meningeal layer. The function of the cerebrospinal fluid is really to protect the brain and create a unique environment around the brain, sorry, that is separate from the rest of the vascular system. I'm going to take a sip of water here. All right. So we'll start with the lateral ventricles, and the lateral ventricles are off to the sides. We have right and left. Now they connect via the interventricular foramen to the third ventricle. And again, the third ventricle is right around the thalamus. And then from there, they move into the cerebral aqueduct, which is a very tiny tunnel that leads to the fourth ventricle. And then the fourth ventricle leads to the subarachnoid space. So you can see how it's created. It's actually made by the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is a lining of cells that creates the cerebrospinal fluid. It circulates to the lateral ventricles first, then to the third ventricle via the interventricular foramen, then to the fourth ventricle by the cerebral aqueduct, and then to the subarachnoid space. It eventually gets collected via the sinuses. So we talked about the sinuses earlier, where we have the supraesophageal sinus being the large sinus found in the longitudinal fissure. And so that is one of the main channels that collects that drainage after it circulates around the brain and spinal cord. And that is how it's circulated and continuously being produced. Now, the ventricular system, just to point them out internally, if we were to take this out of the brain itself, this is the lateral ventricle, this is the left lateral ventricle, and then right lateral ventricle would be on the other side, right? Now, they connect via the foramen, the interventricular foramen, to the third ventricle. And the interventricular foramen is just a tiny opening. And again, the third ventricle is surrounding the thalamus, which is connected across by the interthalamic adhesion. And then from there, the circulation goes to the fourth ventricle, which is through the cerebral aqueduct. So it goes through another tiny opening, then fourth ventricle, then it goes through two smaller openings before it goes into the subarachnoid space.